what is up? My name is David Nibbs, and if you're watching this video, you're probably a podcast creator. But think about for a second when you're listening to podcasts. You have your favorite podcast. Maybe it's Joe Rogan or the Dave Ramsey podcast or something like that. How many of those podcasts have you actually left a review on? Think about it for a second. Maybe you're somebody who understands the importance of supporting a podcast with a review. Or maybe you're sometimes somebody like me who loves podcasts. You'll tell your friends about them. You'll post on social media about them. But actually going on to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leaving your 5-star review, it doesn't always come naturally to you. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about 4 simple techniques that you guys can use in your daily podcasting routine to get more reviews on your podcast. My name is David Nibbs, and I love making videos for marketers, podcasters, and business owners just like you who are looking to grow and scale their business. If you're looking for more content like this, go ahead and click that subscribe button down below because I have so much more content coming in the very near future. So let's get into step number 1. All right, so the first technique, the first strategy that I want to give you guys is to make sure that you're doing all of these techniques often and you're asking for reviews often. Now, what do I mean by this? This might sound very simple, but also, I know that you guys might watch this video. You're super stoked. You're like, I'm gonna go and get a ton of reviews on my podcast. You'll do it a couple of times, you'll implement it for a couple of episodes, and then it'll stop, and you'll go back to just your normal routine. The number one thing that I suggest before I get into these 3 additional techniques is to make sure that everything that you guys learn in this video and in every other tactic that you decide to implement, you do it consistently. Because think about it. If you get told one time to leave a review on my podcast, there's lots of listeners who are driving, they're food shopping, they're cleaning around the house. They're not always just sitting here, relaxing, listening to a podcast where it's convenient for them to sit down and leave a review. And for a lot of people, they might be driving and thinking, yeah, I'd love to leave a review and show my support and get this maybe a little bit of an incentive. But they forget. So you have to ask over and over again and remind your listeners how important it is to have reviews on your podcast. Okay, so that's step number 1, and that's a really important thing. Don't forget to stay consistent with asking for reviews. All right, now what's step number 2 and tactic number 2 that's going to take your podcast reviews to the next level? The second technique is to actually highlight and showcase your podcast reviews online. So what do I mean by this? So have you ever listened to a podcast and in the beginning of the podcast, they're actually shouting out somebody who left a review? So it might be something like, hey there, this is the David Nibbs podcast, not a real thing. And they're saying, but before we get started, I want to highlight one of my awesome listeners who left a review on Apple Podcast earlier this week. David said, hey David, thank you so much for all the awesome content. You've changed my life, blah, 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 blah. And then you say, hey, thanks, man. I really appreciate you leaving a review. And if you guys want to get featured on my podcast, go on over to Apple, Spotify, or another player and leave a review. This is something that you guys can do at the beginning of the podcast or the end, and it can be a short little snippet that people are used to hearing about others being highlighted. Now, why do you do this? Because as a listener, everybody loves to be shouted out. People love to hear their name mentioned and talked about. They feel good about themselves. And if I hear that you're shouting out Tom or Nick or Samantha or Ashley, I want to go leave you a review so that I can be considered to be shouted out on your podcast. This is a really great incentive for people. Another way that you guys can do this is on your Instagram stories. You can actually screenshot some of the reviews and highlight them on your stories to showcase people that way as well. And for people that are scrolling through and they want to be featured on your stories or somewhere else as well, they're going to go and leave a review so that they can be included. And make sure you let people know that if they want to be the next person that you highlight, all they have to go and do is leave a 5-star review on your page. It's going to be a really great way to build your podcast reviews. Okay, so the third technique that I want to give to you guys is to actually give people a call to action at the end of your episode. So what do I mean by this? You have to tell people what they need to do. All right, so if you're telling people, go and leave a review on my podcast, For some people, they might not even know what a review is. You need to tell them to go leave a review. So perhaps the best time to do this is at the end of a podcast episode. Because in the beginning, they're just listening to the episode, they haven't gotten the value yet, they haven't even listened to the content yet. But if somebody listens to your 10, 30, 60-minute episode and they get all the way to the end where your outro is, ask them to leave a review. Because if somebody got 100% of the way through, it means that you probably really provided some awesome content that they loved and they want to go and give back with thanks to you. So for example, what I mean by this is at the end of the episode say, hey guys, thanks so much for listening. If you really enjoyed this podcast, I would be so grateful if you went and left me a review on the podcast player of your choice. It really goes a long way in building the show and building a community and growing the show to new levels. Let people know that by leaving you a review, it's not just letting you know that you're doing a great job and it feels good, but it's also building the show's performance. If somebody really enjoys something, they want to be a part of its growth, so you need to remind them. So don't just include this every once in a while in an episode. Make sure part of your normal outro script is asking people to go onto your page and leaving them a review. I promise it'll make a huge difference. All right, so step number 4, and my 4th tactic to make sure that you're growing your podcast reviews is that whenever somebody shouts out your podcast, so for example, if people take a screenshot of your podcast, they tag you on their Instagram stories and they say, loving this fire episode, reply to that person and say, hey man, thank you so much, or hey there, thank you so much. I'd be so appreciative if you went and left me a review. Or if in a Facebook group that you have, or maybe one of your customers says, hey, I've been listening to your podcast and you've been changing my life, ask them to leave a review. Don't just say, hey, thanks so much, or I appreciate it, or don't just like their post. And because what's going on here is you have a raving fan who's shouting you out on their social media. This is the perfect person to ask to go leave you a review. So if you're getting those awesome shout outs, make sure you're utilizing those people and asking them to go onto the podcast player of choice. And remember, one thing that's super important, one of my pro tips for you is to understand that a lot of people don't know how to leave a review. So for example, you can say, if you're an Apple podcast, go onto the show, scroll onto the bottom where you'll find the reviews and click write a review. On Spotify, go onto that page, make sure you understand how to leave a review so that you can vocalize that to your listeners. People want to make it very, very simple, and they need to know that leaving a review will only take just a couple of moments. So I hope this video helped you guys out and will help you start moving towards getting more podcast reviews for your show. If you guys are interested in learning how to run Facebook ads to build your podcast, go ahead and click here to check out one of my recent videos on how to run Facebook ads to build your podcast downloads. Thank you guys so much for watching. I have so much more content on marketing, business, and personal finance coming to you that I would be so grateful if you went and clicked that subscribe button down below if you're interested in watching more. Now take the tactics that I just gave you and go implement them in your podcast to start building your reviews. Thank you guys and have an awesome day.